In the murder trial, Diarmuid Phelan, the law professor and senior counsel accused of murdering a trespasser on his land. Yesterday we saw the closing speech from senior counsel for the prosecution, for the DPP, and Roisin Lacey, senior counsel, concluded her submission, her closing speech to the DPP, or to the jury today. And in concluding her closing address, she said that Mr. Phelan's introduction of a firearm during a purely verbal argument with Mr. Conlon and Mr. Coleman was disproportionate and excessive. She says that the DPP says, the state says that he's guilty of murder. When Mr. Conlon was shot by Mr. Phelan, he was unarmed and was engaged in a verbal argument which did not call for the introduction of weapons, she said. So this is what she put to the jury. Mr. Phelan, she said, had no idea what projectiles were going to come out of his Smith & Wesson revolver when he fired it 3 times, she said. Mr. Phelan had told Gardaí he fired the revolver over the heads of Mr. Conlon and Mr. Coleman, but the prosecution said that he directed the revolver towards or in the direction of them, and the 3rd shot hit Mr. Conlon in the back of the head, she said. Essentially the DPP, the state, is saying that they've proved their case. They say this is murder and they've shown the evidence that it's murder. How did this match Mr. Phelan's own view that he had reached a level of responsible competence when dealing with firearms? Counsel asked. The hollow-pointed bullet was later removed from the back of Mr. Conlon's head, and the entry wound was 6 centimetres below the top of the head, she said. The jury had heard evidence that mixing birdshot and hollow-pointed bullets in the revolver, as Mr. Phelan said was the general practice, is very dangerous, counsel said. Mr. Phelan had told Gardaí his general practice was to load the 8-chamber revolver with 5 hollow-pointed bullets and 3 birdshot, and he had believed when firing the weapon, birdshot was being discharged, she said. Mr. Phelan had also said he could not remember when the revolver was last reloaded. He believed it might have been 4 weeks earlier or what it was reloaded with. The prosecution case was that the evidence was consistent with the revolver having been loaded with 8 hollow-pointed bullets, she said. Then we had the closing speech of Mr. Phelan's senior counsel. Mr. Phelan's senior counsel is Sean Gearan. Sean Gearan told the jury that the fatal shooting of the trespasser on the farm of Diarmuid Phelan is a tragedy and a grievous waste of human life, but it did not happen as a result of a crime of Mr. Phelan's, the jury was told by Sean Gearan, senior counsel. 3 shots fired by Mr. Phelan from his Smith & Wesson revolver were only ever intended to be warning shots, so there was no intent for murder, Sean Gearan said. There may also be issues of self-defense to consider if the jury accepted aspects of the prosecution case, he outlined. He was opening his closing address on behalf of Mr. Phelan, who has denied the murder of Keith Bono Conlon in February 2022. And Mr. Gearan told the jury that the case is all about emotions, particularly the emotions of fear and anger. The prosecution say Mr. Phelan was angry when he shot Mr. Conlon. Our case is he was in fear. So this is the difference, the major difference or dichotomy between the prosecution and defence. The prosecution say that Mr. Phelan shot in anger, and the defence, Mr. Gearan, said that he was in fear and he shot in fear. These emotional states, like all other facts, had to be proven, he said. The defence is asking the jury, akin to James Joyce's novel Ulysses, which told the story of Dublin by following a man around the city over an entire day, to walk in the shoes of Mr. Phelan and to look inside his mind, Mr. Gearan said. So that's what the defence is doing. The defence, Mr. Gearan, is asking the jury to put themselves into the shoes of Mr. Phelan. And the use of the reference to James Joyce's novel is interesting, in my view, because quite frankly, I'm not sure that too many Irish people have actually read the book. I know a lot of people will claim they've read it, but I'm not so sure how many have actually read it. So I'm not sure whether that's a good reference for Mr. Gearan, but he's the senior counsel and he's Mr. Phelan's defence counsel. Mr. Gearan began his closing address shortly after noon today, Tuesday, in the trial. Mr. Phelan has pleaded not guilty to murder of Mr. Conlon. The 8-week trial has heard at the Central Criminal Court has heard that Mr. Conlon and 2 other men, Mr. Coleman and Mr. Duggan, were using a dog to hunt down badgers and or foxes when trespassing on the farm that day. After Mr. Phelan, who the jury was told was concerned about lambing ewes, shot a lurcher dog belonging to Mr. Coleman, there were heated exchanges with the trespassers and 2 of them followed him up a field. The prosecution case, his 2 shots were fired into the air by Mr. Phelan from his Smith & Wesson revolver, and a 3rd penetrated the body of Mr. Conlon. The prosecution case is when the 3rd shot was fired, the deceased was shot in the back of the head as he turned away, and in the circumstances, Mr. Phelan had the requisite intent for murder. Mr. Phelan, the trial has told Gardaí that he was scared shitless and he was terrified and he was stressed, etc. So Mr. Gearan's closing speech to the jury will continue tomorrow, Wednesday, and after that then the judge will have to instruct the jury and advise them about the law and advise them as to what questions they must answer. And after that then it'll be like placing a bird into the hands of the jury. It'll be entirely over to them to find whether Mr. Phelan is guilty of murder or not. Hope you find the video useful. If you do, would appreciate if you hit the thumbs up button down below. Thank you very much. Sean Gearan is to continue his closing speech to the jury tomorrow, but it just struck me afterwards that Sean Gearan is the choice of Mr. Phelan, and Mr. Phelan is a senior counsel and a law professor himself, so that's a fair old recommendation for Sean Gearan. So obviously he's probably at the top of his game, but you know, if you're looking for somebody to defend you in a murder case, obviously Mr. Phelan has opted for Sean Gearan, so he must be pretty good. So it'll be interesting to see what Mr. Gearan has to say tomorrow. He'll be finishing his closing speech to the jury tomorrow, and it's all about the 2 senior counsel selling the story or persuading the jury that their version of events and their capturing of the circumstances and the emotions and the events and the motivations and so on, that their version of events is more plausible. And so Mr. Gearan is talking about emotions and fear, and the other senior counsel is talking about anger, and that's basically what the jury is going to have to decide